Have you started recording? Excellent.
I have, yes.
Okay. So yeah, while those are loading, just think by way of introduction, Sarah's already said that I have experience working on various clinical trials for Fragile X syndrome and autism. I'm based up in Edinburgh, obviously with Sarah, where we're both part of the Patrick Wild Centre, which is a research centre where we have particular interest in understanding genetic conditions associated with neurodevelopmental conditions, and in linking up findings that we find in clinical populations with those that are developed by our colleagues who work in the lab. And then as part of that, one of the things that we've been involved in for, Sarah said, 15 years, has been various clinical trials, usually but not always, of medicines for these sorts of conditions. So what I'm going to do tonight is, I mean, the idea of these webinars is really to sort of talk about basic principles, I suppose, or give people a bit of information about what we do. I'm not going to talk about specific conditions. I'll refer to some, obviously, but I'm not here to give kind of updates about the latest trials in any particular condition, because we've got people joining from lots of different backgrounds and things tonight. Before I start properly, I will always declare my declarations of interest, where some of the research funding that we have received from our research groups funded by a combination of philanthropic money, so donated money, grant funds from various kind of official organizations, and then commercial funding mainly from doing clinical trials, with some extra funding brought in by sort of consultancy work that I do for various companies, giving advice about clinical trial development. All of this money, it doesn't come to me, it does go into our research group, but it does, it represents obviously a conflict of interest. If you want to, you can go and search me up on this nicely named website, which is called whopaysthisdoctor.org, where I will always try and transparently declare all of my interests and commercial things working in this field. So I like to start with a bit of history, just out of interest more than anything else. This is thought to be one of the first recorded clinical trials, from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. And those of you who went to church Sunday school like I did growing up in Northern Ireland might remember that Daniel and three of his sort of followers were offered a diet of meat and wine by Nebuchadnezzar. And they said they didn't want that. They said they wanted to continue eating their pulse and water, which is a sort of vegetarian diet, I gather. And Daniel said, okay, we'll tell you what, give us 10 days, we'll eat the pulse and water. You guys can have the meat and wine. And then after 10 days, we'll look and see who is doing better. So there was 4 people in the pulse and water group. We don't really know who the comparison population were, but after 10 days, maybe unsurprisingly, the vegetarian group had countenances which appeared fairer and fatter in flesh. So they had an outcome measure of how they looked physically after those days. And that is thought to be one of the first recorded instances of a clinical trial. The first modern trial, I guess, modern in that it was about almost 300 years ago now, but people will be aware of this. A man called James Lind was the ship's doctor in the HMS Salisbury, and he was doing research about scurvy. He was actually an Edinburgh-based doctor, but he was in the Navy. He was doing research on scurvy. And what he did on this ship was he got 12 sailors, all of whom had scurvy, and he divided them into 6 groups. And these were the kind of, commonly employed treatments for scurvy at the time. So there was 2 people in each group. You can see that group 5 got 2 oranges and 1 lemon, which, as we know, is going to be the effective treatment. But in those days they didn't. I feel sorry for the group who got the medicinal paste of garlic, mustard seed, and horseradish, or those who got the dilute sulfuric acid. But what they found after 6 days was that group 5, those on citrus fruits, recovered. And at that point, they stopped the trial. Unfortunately for everybody else, the reason, as far as I can tell, they stopped the trial was because they ran out of citrus fruit. So while group 5 recovered, the longer term outcome of groups 1 to 4 and group 6 are not actually reported. So That was where trials began, and they've moved forward an awful lot since that time. But what is a clinical trial? This is a World Health Organization definition. I think most people here will probably be aware of this, what it is, what it means. They're basically research that looks to study new tests or interventions and sees whether they help people, evaluates their effects on human health outcomes. We mainly think of them about interventions, but you can do clinical trials studying new diagnostic tests, for example, to see whether that helps people, their health get better. But broadly speaking, they're a way of testing new treatments to see if they're helpful. And when I say treatments, what do I mean? What can we test in clinical trials? Pretty much anything is the honest answer. They're definitely best suited for medication-based treatments, sort of in relatively simple treatments. So things where you would be able to give someone a medicine and see if it helped them. And they can be treatments which are, supportive treatments designed to help with symptoms of a condition. Or they can be things like targeted treatments, which are kind of designed at the kind of underlying fundamental aspects of a condition. You can also use clinical trials to look at non-medication therapies, diets, as we've seen in the book of Daniel, but also other interventions, talking therapies, language interventions. These are a bit more complicated, as we'll see when I'm talking about the importance of blinding in treatment trials, not being aware of the treatment you're on. Much harder to do with these non-medication therapies, and particularly hard to do with medical devices, things like deep brain stimulation or vagal nerve stimulation for epilepsy. It's possible, but it is more complicated doing tests of these. And I'll touch on a little bit about genetic therapies and some of the kind of, I've got one or two slides just about how they're currently being tested and some thoughts about that. Other things which are harder to test in clinical trials are what we call complex interventions. So things like, where there's lots of different components to it. I remember I once had a colleague who was trying to work out, is it better if you have a stroke to be admitted to a specialist stroke unit or to a standard unit? And that's harder to test because there's so many different factors that feed into whether or not, what is actually helpful in that sort of intervention, being admitted to a different part of the hospital. But largely tonight, what we're going to talk about, it will be mainly medication-based therapies, because that's largely the easiest to kind of understand, and that's where these sort of trials were developed. So first of all, I'll go through just some sort of important concepts or things to kind of think about, is because these influence why trials are done the way they are. The first thing is, why do treatments make people feel better? That's why ultimately we give people treatments or interventions. But what is it that actually leads to someone feeling better after they have a treatment? One possible reason is the treatment's actually effective. Citrus fruits do cure scurvy because they contain ascorbic acid or vitamin C, and that is, the scurvy itself is a deficiency syndrome where you don't have enough vitamin C. So, that's the number one reason that, treatments should hopefully make people feel better, and that they actually work. There's also this pesky thing called the placebo effect, which I think most of you will have heard of. And this is just the tendency for treatments, even dummy treatments or sham treatments like sugar pills, will make people feel better if they take them. Now, there's lots of different components to that, but it is mainly actually psychological, to do with kind of expectations, and what people think the treatment is going to do, and then that can have effects on some of their the way they interpret their symptoms or the way they feel. So, particularly trials which involve the brain, where you're looking at subjective symptoms, are quite vulnerable to the placebo effect. Things, people feeling a bit calmer because they know they're taking a treatment, is quite an important thing. And it's one of the difficulties in the kind of clinical trials and things that we do. If you go see your doctor, you might get some other advice during the appointment as well. So you might get told something, or you'll have, hopefully, I say hopefully because I don't know if this is always the case, it's not just going to be about medicine, or if you go see a therapist, you might get some other advice. So you have your main treatment, but there's other things that are discussed, and that might change slightly what you do, which might help, your situation a bit. A bit related to that as well is that there's just non-specific effects of seeing a clinician. Going and seeing someone who, again, I say hopefully will give you some time and listen to you and discuss your condition or your child's condition with you and appears to understand this is helpful. There's no doubt that these are important parts, and we know in psychiatry, which is the field that I actually clinically practice in, we know that those sort of non-specific therapist effects are really actually important for how people feel. And then there's this other thing, which I'm not going to go into detail too much, but to some extent, it's just chance, or what we call regression to the mean. So if you're doing a trial of someone who has epilepsy, and their kind of average amount of seizures is maybe 3 a day, and I see them on one day, they may have 1 seizure that day. The chances are the next time I see them, they're going to be closer to 3. Because people will tend to, I'm seeing them on a particularly good day. If they'd had 5, 6 seizures that day, that's a particularly bad day. So just by chance, the next time I see them, they're more likely to have be closer to their average of 3 seizures. So you get this effect called regression to the mean, which is one of the reasons why people can feel worse sometimes or better, and it can just be kind of a chance alone. And what this does is it adds what we would call statistical noise. It makes it harder to distinguish a real effect of a medicine as a result of this kind of these chance findings or this regression to the mean. The other thing, which is important when we're designing trials and thinking about why, how we do them and how we do them well, is the idea of bias. I think everybody knows what bias means. I thought particularly topical with these 2 headlines from different sides of the political divide today, reporting on exactly the same increase in minimum wage. This is political bias in the media, which is it's very obvious, and we all understand what that means. In trial senses, in clinical trials, we worry about a few types of bias. And they're not always totally obvious, I suppose. I'm not going to cover all of them, but some of the main ones, one of the main ones is called selection bias. So, if you look back at this, this trial by Daniel and the diet, the 4 people who went into the study had been living on this vegetarian healthy diet for a while. And the other people in this trial, who they were being compared to, have been living on a diet of meat and wine for a while. And, whether that's a selection bias that's different at the start. The first group are on the, healthier diet at the beginning. So it's perhaps not surprising that they look healthier at the end because they started off healthier. So there's a risk of selection bias if you're choosing who goes into your trial and who you're treating. That's going to then, or who you're treating with what. That's going to affect your ultimate results. There's also measurement bias. Again, really important. This is where someone might actually assess what's happening, assess whether the treatment's working differently depending on the treatment group. So in the example of scurvy that we talked about earlier, if James Lind, the ship's physician, had his own ideas about what was going to work, 2 oranges and a lemon, I think that's the key thing. I reckon that's what's going to work. He's going to just both possibly consciously, because he wants to prove that he's right, but more likely, to be honest, unconsciously, he might mark the people who have the scurvy. He say, actually, those people in group 5, they're doing a bit better. And that's because he thinks that the oranges and lemon are going to be the key thing that's going to work. And that's a kind of unconscious measurement bias. And that's more common, I think, than the kind of very deliberate bias where someone has said, well, I know you're on the treatment I want to work, so I'm going to report it as better. So you do, if you know what treatment someone's on, if you have positive feelings towards that treatment for whatever reason, you're more likely to report people on that treatment as improved. And that introduced a form of bias. And what was developed, or what happened over the years since Lind did his trial, is that people have come up with this technique to deal with these matters. And I think most people now have probably heard of what we would call double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials. So what does that mean? I mean, what it means is that it is chance, so that's randomized as to what treatment you get. That's to get rid of selection bias. So, if we have 6 people come to the study and they each get allocated randomly to treatment A or treatment B, then the idea is that there's no selection bias. I'm not choosing, or no one is choosing, what groups that they go into or what treatments they get. The idea behind the double-blind part is that neither the person coming into the trial nor the people running the trial, the doctors who they're seeing, know what treatment they're on. So that means that there's double blind. There's 2 groups that are blind. There's also single blind trials sometimes where, for example, the patient might not know what treatment they're on, but the doctor does. But the gold standard is these double blind trials where nobody knows. And that's to get rid of the idea of sort of measurement bias as well. And then finally, the placebo-controlled part is to get rid of the non-specific effects or the placebo effects that we talked about earlier. So it means that, some of the group coming in will get the active treatment, some of the group coming in will get the placebo, but everything else for them will be the same. So you're kind of controlling for taking account of all those non-specific effects and placebo effects. And you're looking for how much your treatment really shows improvement over and above placebo. And that's what that phrase or that term means. That's what a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial is. Now, just as I mentioned earlier, some treatments lend themselves to this model more than others. Very hard to blind a talking therapy to a patient. How would you get a patient in a study not knowing what type of talking therapy they're getting or what diet they're on or whether or not they're getting the language intervention or not, so trials of non-medical therapies often can't run in that double blind sort of way. They do still manage to do a single blind, so because the people who rate, the therapists aren't blinded, but the people rating the improvement. We did a study of part of a bigger study for another group of art therapy for people with learning disability recently. And the rater for the study, who was rating whether or not the people improved, didn't know what intervention they were getting. The therapist did, the person did, but the person doing the ratings to say whether they were better as a result, they didn't know what they were getting. So that's when you have a single blind trial. Also hard to, or you start to run into, other issues about blinding in terms of things like where you have medical devices and things. And then for gene therapies as well, I'll talk a bit about this later. There's a bit of concern around some of them can be quite invasive, as those of you will have heard about in the other talk that Ralph did last time, as to whether it's ethical to use placebos and things in those groups. So not all interventions lend themselves very well to this double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled randomized trial that we do for medicines. But so say we are doing one for a medicine, just as a kind of standard thing. This is a very simple, hopefully, schematic of what it looks like. A 2-arm trial where you've got 2 groups. One get the active treatment, one get the placebo. You measure how they're doing at time 1 before they start the medicines, and then you measure how they're doing at time 2. And at that point, you compare the people who've been on the active treatment against those who've been taking the placebo. And that allows you to see if they have done better or worse or the same. This is the gold standard of RCT, randomized controlled trial. This is the gold standard of RCT, which is generally required for treatments to be approved. They take a lot of people. We need to recruit lots of people for these studies. There's trials that I've been involved in, indeed the ones that Chris and Mark were both in, where you would be recruiting around about 300 people in total, which would be it's a relatively small randomized controlled trial. So 300 people isn't too much if you're doing things for, say, really common conditions like high blood pressure or something. It's a lot when you're looking at relatively rare genetic conditions. So this trial design, it is the gold standard. It's what needs to be done for a treatment to be kind of proven and to be approved by medical regulators and things. But it does take, and it provides really good evidence, but it's, takes a long time, requires lots of different sites, trial sites working it, and has to recruit a lot of people. So they're very expensive and complex to run. A variant of this, which isn't what would be used to kind of approve a drug, usually used kind of earlier on in drug development, is what's called a crossover design, where you need fewer people. And you need fewer people for two reasons. One, everyone gets the active treatment eventually, so you just don't need as many people. And two, at the end, you're comparing each person, how they were on the active treatment to how they were on the placebo. And that is just a really powerful way to look for whether which has had an effect. So what you would do here is that you have two groups. The first one starts on the active treatment. The second group starts on the placebo. They take those for a while. Then they have a break where they're not on any medicines or anything, called the washout period. And then they flip around. So group one, which had the active treatment first, now goes on the placebo. Group two goes on the active treatment. So as I say, they need fewer people. They're very powerful to find effects. They do take longer. And then one of the bigger problems with them can be that they're vulnerable to carryover effects. If the active treatment that group one's on, first of all, keeps working after it's kind of out of the system, it's done something, changed something physiologically, then it means that when you go on to the placebo in the next round, you're not going to show, you'll still be benefiting from the effects of the first treatment. So that's called a kind of carryover effect. What you really want for these sort of trials are things where people return to baseline almost in between. But as I say, most commonly used in earlier phase trials as a way of kind of starting to test medicines and things before you want to go into the big double-blind RCT. I want to mention this. This is a trial design that we've got more and more interested in, actually, here in Edinburgh, and are currently trying to develop this as a model. Not just us, other people as well. But these are called N of 1 trials. So this is a bit like a single person crossover study. So what you do is you get one person and they are at different points over a period of time will be on either the treatment or the placebo in a random fashion that nobody knows what order they're on. So you might be on the treatment for 4 weeks, on the placebo, then on the placebo for another 4 weeks, then the treatment, back again, etc. And you do lots of measurements throughout. Now, not all medicines are suitable for these N of 1 trials. Again, those which have carryover effects are probably less suitable because you would find it would obscure the changes or differences you'd expect on the treatments. But say for medicines like anti-ADHD medicines, which work quickly and which when they wear off, the effect wears off, they're actually very good trials to do. They're a really nice way of telling whether for one person they're really benefiting from these medicines or not. And this is a really super gold standard of treatment for one individual, and it's how you can really tell beyond doubt, getting rid of all of the chance and all that stuff, whether a medicine is really going to work for someone. The problem obviously is that this is only for one individual. The other problem as well is that it takes a long time to do these studies and it requires lots of different measurements to be done. So not just at the start and the end of each treatment block, but measurement kind of throughout them. Because that allows you then to be really confident about what you're finding in each treatment block, or the effect of the drug in each treatment block. So, as I say, they're designed originally for looking at how a medicine might work for only one person. But what has been, increasingly realized is actually, there are quite complex statistical ways that you can actually combine. You can do N of 1 trials in maybe 10 people, and then you can combine the results for each person all together. And because you're so confident of the results for each person, that then means that you can start to make what we call inferences of population. You can extend those results to the broader population. And that, because it's such a kind of powerful way of doing these sort of tests, or of testing treatments means that you can actually get some quite good idea about whether a medicine works or whether medicine's likely to work for the broader population of people using much fewer people than a traditional randomized controlled trial. It doesn't suit all interventions. It's not yet, a regulator, drug regulator is not going to approve this. But if we're thinking about doing trials for already existing medicines, that can be things like stimulants and stuff or anti-ADHD medicines, but other medicines for genetic conditions as well. These N of 1 trial model might be a way of doing, feasibly doing studies in relatively rare conditions that might actually be useful for the broader population of people. Lastly, in terms of trial design, I'll mention this: unblinded, uncontrolled trials. So after all the kind of banging on I've gone about bias and selection bias and measurement bias and placebo effects and all that stuff, you will still get, and there will still be clinical trials which are just everyone is on the treatment. Everyone knows they're on the treatment. There's no control. It's not usually considered good evidence whether a treatment works. It's what you do very early on for look at safety and things like that in kind of medicine development or in follow-up studies. So once you've been on the double-blind randomized controlled trial, sometimes there'll be a follow-on study where everybody gets to go on the medicine and everybody knows that they're on it. And that's a good thing, I think, for participants, because it means when you come into a study, you know eventually you're going to be offered the active medicine or treatment. And it also allows people developing these things to look at longer term effects. You can't really keep people in a blinded trial for years. It's not really ethical to do that. But if you have everybody knowing what they're taking, then you can look at longer term effects and longer term safety and things. So one exception, and I kind of hinted at this earlier, is that there are a number of unblinded and uncontrolled trials of some of the newer genetic therapies in brain conditions or other conditions as well. And that's because there's a couple of reasons. One, the mode of delivery of some of these genetic therapies for the brain is quite invasive. We talked about this last time. I mean, it can involve anesthesia and then injecting medicine into the ventricles, so a part of the brain. Or injecting into the spinal cord because that's what they need to get into the brain at the moment. So it becomes, there are ethical concerns about using placebos in those trials. There's pros and, to me, there are pros and cons. There's definitely, you're putting people through pretty invasive procedures. So using a placebo, there are definitely ethical questions. But there's also ethical questions about giving everyone a treatment that you don't know if it's going to work or not, and that you're going to be then trying to, decide if it is on the basis of this. The big kind of exception to that really is if there is, a profound effect that's just really different from how a condition normally goes. The natural course of a condition, if the gene therapies or any therapy is just so effective, then you might not need a control group because you could tell just by knowing the natural history of a condition that the way that this group has reacted to the gene therapy, the genetic therapy is different. It's very clear that it's working. So a good example of that were these trials for a thing called spinal muscular atrophy. This is an approved gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy. Medicine's called Zolgensma. And it was approved on the basis of these sort of open label, single arm trials, so unblinded, uncontrolled trials. And that's so because, this was of type 1 SMA, and SMA is a really difficult can be there's type 0 and type 1, very tragic conditions where children will often die before the age of 2. So very severe, early onset, deteriorating course. And what Zolgensma, what that treatment, Zolgensma, has done, they found that at 14 months of age, extending out to 18 months, and they've looked beyond this as well, that over 90% of those children were still alive. They weren't being ventilated. Many of them could still walk. Just things that just were never going to happen otherwise. That's just totally out of question for the natural history. And that's allowed that treatment to then move and to be developed, and is actually available, under pretty strict conditions because it's so expensive, but is available for types of SMA. There's not many treatments are as effective as that. And even the genetic therapies for some of the brain conditions, neurodevelopmental conditions are unlikely to have that sort of to have that sort of transformative effect was really massive. But a lot of them do run without control groups, and are comparing against natural history of the condition. Um, yeah, because of the idea that the effects should be so noticeable that you don't necessarily need a control group. Okay, that sort of leads on. So if we talk about noticeable effects and how we measure things, outcome measures in clinical trials are a big important part of them. What do we actually measure to show that something has worked or not worked? So an outcome measure is basically a tool or variable or a measurement, which is used to assess the impact of an intervention. So when we use the term outcome measure, it's basically what is the thing we're measuring that's going to tell us that our drug or other treatment works. So the to, important when designing a trial, and just I think important or interesting for people to know is that you have to. This is a guy, I think he's called John Crawford. This is where one of the phrases of pinning your colors to the mast comes from. It's some, the idea that you've got to sort of openly declare yourself for, a specific thing. Um, and you have to do that in clinical trials before you start the trial. You have to say before you start any drug trial or other trial, what is your primary outcome measure? What is the thing that you think is going to be most affected or is going to show that your medicine, your treatment works? That's relatively straightforward in some ways. If you are doing, say, a study of blood pressure lowering drug. Well, you're going to measure blood pressure. That's going to be your primary outcome measure. Much more complicated in your developmental conditions, which affect lots of different parts of someone. They can affect behavior. And they can affect people differently as well. So you'll all know that, if you see a child with one of a genetic condition associated with neurodevelopment, that they can look very different from another child with the same condition. There'll be some features that look the same, but it's hard to know exactly what is the measure that is going to be best used to demonstrate difference or effectiveness of the drugs. You can then do secondary outcome measures. You can do lots of other things as your secondary outcomes, exploratory measures, stuff. The thing about that is that if you run a big clinical trial, big randomized controlled trial, and you have lots of benefits seen in all your secondary outcome measures, but your primary outcome measure isn't better or isn't enough better, it doesn't show a large enough effect, it can be a failed trial. So that even though you would have lots of good effects seen in these other measures, secondary outcome measures, if you don't hit your primary outcome, your study has not succeeded. You'd have to do another trial, taking one of your secondary outcomes, using that as your primary outcome, and then do a whole nother trial to prove that it actually works. So drug regulators and things will not approve a new treatment on the basis of secondary outcome measures. That's not to say they're not useful. They can give you interesting things to try in another trial. For medicines that are already available, there may be a lower bar in terms of whether or not you might say that, oh, well, that suggests this medicine works. But as I say, for a new treatment, you have to show significant effects on the primary outcome. When we do measure in trials, as I've said already, what to measure is always a big question. What aspect of the condition is likely to improve with treatment? Are we targeting epilepsy? Are we targeting anxiety? Are we targeting irritability? Are we targeting learning? Are we targeting language? The answer to some of those questions might be relatively straightforward. If you're using an anti-anxiety treatment, then you're targeting anxiety. But if you look at treatments that are kind of designed to target something fundamental or core about the condition, as we often or increasingly are trying to do for conditions like Fragile X and things like SYNGAP1, conditions we work in, it's hard to know exactly what's going to be what aspect is most likely to improve. I'm going to capture it across lots of people as well. So there's a choice of outcome measure is hard. Once you've chosen what your area you think is going to improve, you then have to think about, well, what makes a good outcome measure? What are we actually going to use? Like, how are we going to measure it? And just some of the characteristics you need is something needs to be easy to measure. It needs to be something that you can do, feasible. It needs to be clinically meaningful. So it needs to actually capture something meaningful that's going to improve quality of life or represent a significant improvement for people with the condition. It needs to be something you can measure reliably. You have a good way of measuring it that when you measure it at different time points, you're measuring it in the same way. And it needs to be something that changes with treatment. And it needs to be something that is objective, or it's best if it's something that is objective. Because that's going to be less vulnerable to things like the placebo effect, things like the non-specific aspects associated with seeing a physician or a clinician that I talked about earlier. So I've talked about blood pressure a bit, and it's actually doing trials for blood pressure lowering agents is not as simple as I sometimes make it out to be, but they are relatively easy to measure. We know that we have good ways, reliable, objective ways of measuring blood pressure. We know that if you give someone an antihypertensive, a blood pressure lowering medicine, it can lower that blood pressure. We know that generally lower blood pressure means lower cardiovascular events like stroke. If you have high blood pressure and you have it lowered to a normal range, you're less likely to have stroke, heart attacks, etc. So it's clinically meaningful. And it's objective. Nobody's guessing your blood pressure just by kind of looking at you. Nobody's kind of trying to decide what it might be just on some kind of subjective measure. Our problem in trials that we do is that a lot of our outcome measures are subjective. You know, is someone better? Are they much better, a bit better, the same, worse, or a lot worse? Um, they're and that you struggle with reliability. You're not necessarily measuring the same thing each time. And they're much more subjective in nature, obviously. So they are more vulnerable to things like placebo effects and these kind of non-specific effects that we have. Now there are ways of improving that. You can do training for people in how you apply these measures. You can do training. Anyone who's taken part in trials will probably had instructions about, okay, so you're completing this measure. We want you to think about your child. We want you to compare them to someone who doesn't have, say, Fragile X syndrome. If you're not sure whether it's a 1 or a 2, then rate it upwards. There are ways you can do to try and make it a bit more objective and a bit more reliable in its way when you use sort of rating scales and things. But ultimately, it can cause problems. And a good example for that was in a trial we were involved in quite some time ago. You don't need to understand this graph, but just the first part of this, the first 4 weeks of this study, everybody was on placebo. And everybody showed improvements in this kind of outcome measure at the time. Some really quite significant improvements. And that's much more likely if you have got these kind of subjective outcome measures. So that's one of the things that makes it, just makes it more complicated in our world, unfortunately. I always said it would be easy to be a cardiologist. So, but it is definitely doing trials in neurodevelopmental conditions have more complications. We're doing lots of ways. Other people are doing lots of ways of trying to look at, are there good ways to measure outcome objectively? Some of you will have taken part in some of these studies looking at sleep or heart rate measurements, looking at EEG, MRI, etc. I don't know that we'll ever get away from subjective outcome measures because ultimately you're not going to approve a drug just because it changes an EEG signal or changes heart rate variability unless you're really sure that that has a clinical meaning for someone. So, it has to then relate to some form of clinical meaning, which is ultimately remains fairly subjective, actually. But these kind of things can help guide us in terms of whether medicines are actually working, whether we should continue trials on, and may even be able to be used as a way of predicting whether people might actually respond to treatments in the future. So there is a lot of work going on in neurodevelopmental conditions to look at better outcome measures. Okay. So I'll just finish up with a few slides about what's kind of involved in clinical trials and drug development, really. I won't go labor these points at all, but just to say there's lots of phases of drug development. New drugs will go through preclinical work, a lot of work on kind of, in laboratories, looking at what a medicine does or what a potential medicine does, at a molecular level, at a cellular level, at a circuit level, then doing work determining whether or not it is safe, what kind of dosing should be given, and lots of work that goes on, in sort of preclinical work before you even get to clinical drug development. Then you have this phases of clinical trials, which range from being the first in human studies, which are usually done in typically developing people, always very much looking at how safety and how the drug is processed. Then moving into kind of, what we call phase 1, 2, and 3 studies, which are basically initially looking very much at safety and tolerability. And safety is a big part throughout them. But as you get further on, you can then start to get larger studies to look at effectiveness. These and phase 3 trials are usually those double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials. And then a medicine can be licensed. I suppose I just want to highlight that it's a very expensive process, costs a lot of money. It's a very lucrative process for the pharmaceutical industry when they get a drug that works, but there's a large amount of investment, which almost limits a lot of drug development to private industry. And it takes quite a long time. The average is 9 years, from beginning to end of this sort of process. So sometimes you see or you might read scientific breakthroughs. People will talk about things in laboratory findings that will point to better treatments. It takes a long time, unfortunately, for it to work through all of these processes. The big exception to that, which everyone will be familiar with, is the COVID vaccines, where, but those were things where you had almost entire scientific industries and international effort put into their developments, as well as a lot of the preclinical work done already. And then a lot of the regulatory kind of steps and things were improved, plus willing populations to take part in the study. So, they were a really good example of what can be done. I don't know that it's realistic to think that it will be done for other conditions. But it would be better. I mean, clearly 9 years is a very long time. And there needs to be some thought about how that massive journey can be reduced. So what happens when you're trying to set up a trial? When they say what's involved in a trial, you have to start off with designing a protocol. You got to decide what you're going to do. You have to think about where you're going to do it. That is easy if it's just you running it in your own kind of area. But that's not going to work for, genetic neurodevelopmental conditions. So you need other sites to be involved. And what you need at each site is expertise about a condition or a willingness to develop expertise about a condition. And you need access to populations. I have that in red because honestly, and I've said this at other things that people have heard me talk, clinical trials for any conditions live or die by whether or not they can recruit enough people into them. And recruitment, particularly in rare genetic conditions, is difficult. And as I said earlier, there's a number of things we can do in trial design that might be able to help this. But ultimately, we need to have good access to populations. We need people who are willing and keen to enter, and sites that are able to run the trials. You need to do training for sites, and then you need to go through the approval process, which in itself can take over a year to do. To get ethical approval, to get NHS approvals for all your sites, to get approvals from the drug regulator, all of that takes time to do. It's one of the reasons why I think often families can feel a bit frustrated, the amount of time it takes for these things to happen. I certainly feel frustrated. We feel frustrated in the amount of time it takes them to happen. But there's just all of these steps that kind of need to be gone through. In terms of actually taking part, you'll hear soon, don't worry, soon from Mark and Chris about their experiences in taking part. What can you expect if you come to see us to take part in a clinical trial of a medicine for a condition? We will have a certain kind of series of things that we're going to have to do at each visit. But before we do that, we will usually speak to you. Usually first contact's often by email these days, but we would then, reply, speak to folk, tell you a bit about the study, send some information to people so that you've got a chance to read about it, and then you have a chance to discuss it all with the trial team beforehand. And then when you actually come on the day of the first visit, we would do what's called informed consent. So in some trials, that's something you sign yourself if it's you who's going into the trial. For a lot of the conditions that we work in, it is a parent or caregiver, welfare guardian, or a legal representative, who would sign for on behalf of another person. Because a lot of people with the conditions that we work with wouldn't understand enough about the trials to be able to say whether they want to do it or not. And really important to that, and what you're asked to do is consider whether or not you think the person you're signing for, if they understood it, would want to do the study. It's not what you want, it's whether or not you think whether they would want to do the study. You then have selection criteria. This is important to mention, and it's, because unfortunately, not everyone who volunteers actually gets onto the trials. Sometimes we go through all of this, you come up, you sign the informed consent, and there may even be people in this call who've been through this with us, where you then have to maybe complete a few questionnaires, and then the basis of the results of those questionnaires, we have to say, I'm sorry, but you're not able to come into the trial. And that's because that's part of the sort of criteria that have been set before the study. And sometimes that's to do with physical things like certain weight, for example, people are. Sometimes it's to do with, there's already lots of people of a certain age or certain gender in the study. Or sometimes they need people who score above or below certain measures on scales to actually get in. So not everyone who volunteers gets in. We were able sometimes to give you a bit of an idea what that might be like before, just from speaking to people. But ultimately, you sometimes don't know until you come and see. If you do get into the trial, then there's a period of randomization. You might actually be given the active treatment, or your child might, or whoever is in the trial might, or they might be get the placebo. That's important. Not everybody who comes into a trial gets the active medicine. So there'll be, and usually it is about 50% of people who would be allocated to placebo. Then, regardless of what you're allocated to, you come and see us. And when we started doing these studies, Sarah will probably tell me I'm wrong, but my memory of it is that we had about 7 or 8 face-to-face visits over the course of 4 months to do, with a few phone calls in between. That's changed a lot. You almost certainly have to come up for our first visit, or come and see, go to your trial site for our first visit. And almost certainly for our last visit. But a lot of the visits in between can now be done virtually, either by phone actually, or we're just now so used to Teams and Zoom and various things which really reduces the burden and things, because we know that travel can be difficult for some folk. So there are a few trials around, and it is possible now to do them entirely virtually. Not all of them, but for some trials it's possible to do it where you wouldn't actually have to travel at all, which makes a big difference, I think, to some folks who just might find traveling with their child or their affected relative or whatever really difficult to do. So you come for appointments, either virtually or face to face. At those appointments, what do? We do safety checks. These are often, for any medicine, you've got to be sure that it's safe. And safety is probably the most, kind of paramount, really, in any clinical trial. We want to make sure that you are well, or the person in the trial as well. That's done through standard physical examinations, vital signs, and unfortunately, blood tests, which can be a red line for some people, that it's just not possible. Others, we find actually, there's been the odd person who's come up and they've managed to have blood tests for the first time in years when they've come into some of the trials and things. So, but if there are blood tests that are part of the study, they're not an optional part. And for some medicines that are really well known, or some interventions, you may not need them, but for a lot you will. We'll do outcome measures, lots of questionnaires. Expect to fill out lots of questionnaires if you're involved in the trial. Interviews. Sometimes we even do tests with people where we'll do things like an EEG, where we're measuring the electrical activity in the brain or something like that. But most commonly for the sorts of studies we do, it tends to be questionnaires and interviews. So you'll run through the trial. At the end of the study, some trials will offer the option of keeping on, an open label continuation. So, carry on in the study. Now everybody will has the chance to go on the active medicine. And I think generally most people in trials that I've been involved in have been keen to move on, because you won't know in the first part of the trial whether you're on placebo or the active medicine. At the end of the study, if there's an open label, then everyone has a chance to go on the active medicine. Now, not all studies offer that. It's important, wherever you go, we'll be upfront about all of it, and we'll let you know whether or not this is going to be the case or not. The other thing to bear in mind is that you won't find out whether the medicine has worked until quite a long time after you've finished in the study. Unless you're the very last participant in the whole international or world, national study, the chances are, you'll be taking part at some point, but the trial's going to run for another year everywhere else to get enough people to come into it. And then there'll be a period of time of a few months, at least, sometimes 6 months, where they're all analyzing the data and things like that. And it's only after that time that you actually find out what the results are. And indeed, it's only after that time that you can maybe find out whether you're on the active drug or the placebo, in the original study. So it's a long time after that you actually hear about what is going on. So that's roughly what you can expect if you came to take part in the study. I'm a bit wary of saying this, given that Mark and Chris are coming after me, but I've generally found that most of the people who are coming to take part, particularly if you get in the study and you can manage the things like the various tests and stuff, have actually quite enjoyed it. It's really nice for us. You get to know people over a long period of time. You get to see families regularly. You hope to get to see things improve for them, and you get to see them in a way that's a bit different from kind of clinical practice. So I have to say, from a personal level, they're a really quite enjoyable thing to do, and like I say, quite rewarding, as people kind of progress and move forward and things on treatments to do various clinical trials. But the people who you probably really want to hear from about what it's actually like are families and parents. So I will hand over to Mark, Chris, and Sarah. And if I start presenting, I think you're going to talk a little bit just about their experiences in clinical trials they've been in. So thanks very much. I think we'll have overall questions and things at the end if there's things people want to bring up.
Thank you so much, Andy. I guess it would be quite good just to ask you one question before you turn your camera off. And I'm going to ask this to Mark and Chris as well. But I guess what would your advice be to give to somebody who is maybe thinking about enrolling their child in a clinical trial, but they maybe weren't sure, they were sitting on the fence? What would you kind of say from a clinician's point of view?
I think it's something that you need to think about. And I think it's helpful, you speak to the people who are at the trial site, find out about the study. If there's particular things you're worried about, they might be able to reassure you about them. They might not, if they can't, because we can't reassure people about everything. The reason for doing trials is because we don't know all of the answers. Then it's up to you to kind of decide what you think about it at that point. If you have the opportunity, we do work with various societies and things, who help to support people with these conditions. And if you have the opportunity to speak to other people who've been involved in trials, I think that's really helpful. That's not always totally easy, but I think that might help make people's mind up, and help them decide what they want to do. People should definitely, the other thing I should say is, if you do take part in a trial and you come along and you think, actually, this isn't for me, you can drop out at any time. You just say you don't have to stay in a trial. People shouldn't feel obliged to. There shouldn't ever be pressure to take part.
Thank you. So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Chris, for agreeing to come and chat with us about all things clinical trials. I'm just going to kick off by asking what factors were kind of the most important to you when you were deciding whether or not to enter your child into a trial? Chris, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So the first two, I've got a little bit of a list, but the first two are pretty obvious, and the number one is safety. I think we all come from the same place, which is we don't want to medicate our children. We don't necessarily want to be on this journey, and we don't want to have to be making these kinds of decisions. But to do that in the safest possible way and to consider that, I think, is the number one. Number two is about the expected outcomes of that trial versus the condition and the impact of that condition to your loved one. So do we think it's going to help? Is it worth the involvement, the time, the travel, the impacts, those sorts of things versus the expected outcomes? So for us on the particular trial that we're talking about today, it was around anxiety and helping our middle son speak. So we wanted to reduce his anxiety, help him engage with the world, and help speech come through. For us, speech is massively important because that's, will help with semi-independence later in life and all those sorts of things. So for us, it was a clear, this trial should help reduce anxiety. We want to achieve speech. So that was our input output. Then we move on to some of the less maybe considered things, which is the wider community impact or output. And Andy touched on it in the slides. Enrolling 300 people into a trial is a large thing, and these trials are very, very expensive. But if we want to have more investment into the conditions to help with support, help with possible treatments, and obviously the word that we don't like to use is cures, but treatments along that way. The pharmaceuticals and other organisations need to know there is an active community to invest in before they even start looking at whether to research condition to then produce a trial later on down the line. So for us, again, taking part in these kinds of things shows that our boys' condition is an active community and one that the wider groups should invest in and support. There's the family outputs. So what do we get back from the trial? And for us on this trial, we were getting an IQ test, an ECG, because our boys' condition can have cardiovascular impacts, blood work, that sort of thing. And they can help with, and have been massively helpful, in fact, in helping us with supporting evidence for things like social care, PIP, DLA, EHCP creation. And you can even ask the trial doctors potentially to write more of an informed report than your GP or paediatricians or others might be able to do, because they'll know your loved one over a longer period of time. And as Andy said, you get to know them in a different setting. So that can be really, really helpful. There was a creation of a hospital passport. So every time we now go to a medical setting, we take the passport with us, which was created through the trial. So the medical professionals get to know straight away what our boys need and don't need. There's the environmental factor. Where are you going? What's the travel like when you're actually there? What was the the actual research place like? Would our boys enjoy being in that environment? And then finally was the open label. We knew we wanted our middle son to have the active drug to reduce anxiety, but knowing our luck, we'd get the placebo. So having the open label at the end of that was something for us that was really important within the trial that we chose. And that's my list of 7 things. So I don't know if Mark's got anything he wants to chuck in, but
no, that was detailed. Thank you, Chris. So my eldest in a red t-shirt. Let me close the door so he can't hear me talking about it at bedtime. Has got Fragile X syndrome, and for us, it was all about benefit versus challenge. So we knew it'd be difficult for him. There's quite a few things, especially in this trial that we were in, that would cause some concern. And it was whether or not the challenge of taking part outweighed the benefit. And we love a list, so we do some pros and cons. We think about the practicalities of it, and then also the kind of more emotive stuff of what's he been struggling with most in the world and in life, and does the perceived benefit of this trial, the purpose of it, outweigh that? And for us it did. There've been other trials where we've had those conversations, decided it didn't. It's really important to have that per trial objectively where possible. But yeah, I think it's important to weigh up the challenges and benefits. And the other thing that Chris said that is really vital, and I wish we thought this strategically and generously, but we didn't, is the participation promotes the cause and the purpose. So I think, it is really important to engage with the research community, and specifically within the clinical trial section, to make it more desirable and to help that research community to draw in the funding and the exposure and visibility. But honestly, we were just thinking about Caleb for us initially, and would it benefit him?
Thank you. Once you'd weighed up those risks and you decided that you were going to come and take part, could you just explain how your child coped with different aspects of the trials? So, for example, traveling, going somewhere new. I know a lot of people worry about blood tests, how that was for your child, and any sort of other aspects that you want to talk about.
So our boys travel well, so that wasn't really a concern. Also, the trial centre for us is only 20 minutes from home, so really easy. And the other aspects such as blood, ECGs, those bits and pieces, yeah, they're the tough ones, I think. And are you being cruel, or are you being cruel to be kind, is kind of the thoughts. And the first blood test for us for our middle son was horrendous, was really tough. It involved me sort of hugging him, pinning him, and that sort of stuff. But the other part of that is he would have to do them at some point in the future anyway. That, we've all had to do it at some point. So is it a good thing to be having that potentially more supportive environment? The staff are often very well trained in the various conditions. My boys have got Fragile X as well, so the staff are well trained in how to support that. And then over time, in making those visits, he's actually now got better and better and better, and he now sits, and the thing that we really wanted is he talks to the staff while they're doing the bloods, and he watches and chirps along with them. So at the start, I would say things like those factors are very difficult, but there is a greater good in it. It's how we feel.
We were very similar. So again, Caleb doesn't mind traveling. He finds social interactions very difficult, but he's socially curious, so he'd hide behind us to begin with. But all the staff are skilled. They're used to neurodiversity, dealing with children and adults with different conditions, and there's a lot of engagement to ensure that they are prepared for your particular person. So we were well received. It was, I think it was a bit of a fun adventure, to be honest, and we did it. So it was just far enough that it felt like a bit of a trip, but it wasn't too far that it was a big undertaking. We stayed overnight. The hotel was lovely. Everybody just had a great time. The only time it slipped was the blood test, and it was exactly the same as Chris's experience. It was difficult. Caleb's very averse to needles. He is super compliant, so he just sat there silently sobbing for 30 minutes whilst some doctors and phlebotomists and all sorts of people were desperately trying to get a vial of blood out of him, but he just wasn't particularly generous bleeding that day. And we thought that might be the end of it. This might be a one and done, even though he had opted into the trial. He himself was in favour of it, and he was excited for the initial trip. At that point, he was like, no, I'm done. So we had to really work with him, and we were quite surprised by, within a couple of visits, how quickly he'd acclimatised, got used to it, to the point where when he goes now and has to have his bloods, he's not excited by it, but he's certainly not anxious. It's not a painful experience, and there's no tears anymore. He's just like, yeah, get it done. We don't know how much of that is due to the success of the trial, and how much of that is due to his own maturing or familiarity, but it's definitely aided by the staff and the centre and the approach, the relaxed nature, and the environment that's provided. So yeah, it couldn't have gone better, but I wouldn't want to say it was easy. There were elements that were tricky still, but the benefit outweighed that.
And I think having that time to give the exposure to the medical setting for us is important, because we don't know what will happen tomorrow in terms of accident and emergency treatment, or for some reason they need treatment and Alex and I can't, and mum and dad can't be there to support them. But if they've been to a caring and nurturing hospital environment first, then it's that whole familiarization bit. So going to hospital now is a breeze for them. They'll skip along and get there themselves.
So you mentioned sort of how tricky sort of the blood tests were to start with, and maybe sort of like pinning them down or whatever. Do you feel that your child's best interests were always a priority during the trial?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that was very important to us as well. And that goes back to the safety aspect as well at the start. If the trial was run by pharmaceutical employees of the company who was developing the drug, you would feel entirely different. But because they're NHS staff, their first and only priority is to the patient, and they're not bothered whether the trial is successful or not successful. That's a little bit unfair. They're obviously invested, but in the bigger picture, they're your child is number one. So right from the very first visit, right from the very point we walked in the door, it felt like they would wave the red flag and stop it before it got anywhere near an unsafe or not positive outcome for the patient, and that's really important, definitely.
We felt it was above and beyond, so that the research centre we went to not only took care of Caleb's individual needs, but the broader family. So we travelled as a family. His little sibling, who you can see in the photo, was with us. It was a few years ago now, but members of staff, one of the research nurses, took Albie off and just had a little play and a chat so that we could support Caleb through that first blood test that was a bit traumatic for him at the time, but he's overcome it by now. But it was those little elements, and Albie knows the professor who's running the trial as well as Caleb does, and they know each other's interests, and it's a lovely catch up. So yeah, it's just a very safe, welcoming, supportive environment for the whole family, not just the person who is a subject to the clinical trial.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you guys now the same question that I asked Andy before. If you had somebody who's thinking about enrolling their child, but they weren't sure, what kind of advice would you give them?
Don't be afraid to ask questions, and just go. Any centre will welcome you with open arms to just go on your own, whether you committed to enrol or not committed to enrol, just to inquire and say, can I come and see you, and have a tour around, get a feel for it. Even if you don't have any questions, if you're unsure in any way, just go walk, have a walk around and meet the people, and then from that things will develop, whether you do or don't feel positive about it. So I would say just reach out. I say hello, definitely. Yeah,
I'd echo that as well. I think as long as your life has capacity at that time, and I think that's really important. If you set yourself up to fail because things are just too busy, and no matter how much you try, you can't protect the time or create the energy to engage, I think don't set yourself up to fail. But if the benefits and the timing work, then just give it a go, even if you're unsure. Just engage with the team, like Chris said, go meet them, explore it a little bit. There is no commitment, and it was a really good valid point that Andy made towards the end, which is, if it ain't going well at any point, you just walk out of it. It's not, there's no contract there. You're a participant in a clinical trial. Yes, people will try to retain you, but at no point is that, a heavy sell or anything like that. It's very much patient orientated. So give it a go. If at any point it's not working for you and yours, if life changes and gets in the way, just bring it up, and if you need to step away, you can. We've certainly had those conversations during our experience in the clinical trial. There were moments where we thought, does the benefit outweigh the challenge at this point? And we had those honest conversations, and it was all supportive, and for us it worked to continue at that time. For others it may not. So I definitely encourage people to give it a go.
Cool. Okay. And then I guess just to it might be quite good just to end on where you see research in the bigger picture of your child's care. You want to go, Chris?
I was popping a picture up so you can see the boys as well.
Oh,
But
lovely. Thank you.
the bigger picture. So I think we can all agree that the world at the moment is not the particularly nicest place, and we have an awful lot of turmoil in global positioning, but also in our local politics and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things that we hear a lot about is the NHS funding, and there isn't enough money to go around. There is big problems, big struggles, and putting my private sector hat on says to me that research is a way of bringing in commercial opportunity to the NHS and funding and that sort of stuff. So we absolutely shouldn't be guinea pigs, and we shouldn't be, sticking people with pins and taking drugs and all that just to try and get healthcare. But I do think it plays a major part in that. We need to attract global investment into the NHS to help pay for that, and I think that will hold back the tide of privatisation and other bits and pieces. So for me, it's very important. I also think that Brexit was a huge blow to research and investment. So again, the more active community we can show, the more opportunity there is. And I've had, through my other bits of work, had chats with global pharmaceuticals, and they've said that the active community that we've been able to show within Fragile X has meant that the UK becomes more attractive for an American trial, where Brexit had made it more attractive to go to France, Italy, and Germany and translate into those than to come to the UK in a native language. And it just, so those sorts of things for me are really important.
For us, at a real local level, so we're fortunate that with Caleb's disability, he does have capacity to have these sorts of conversations, and we do have them with him every year or two. To discuss advancements that are happening within clinical trials, research as a whole, and what that might mean for him in his young adult and older adult life, and at what level does he want to engage or experience. So the trial that he's currently participating in, we had those conversations and he was happy to, and it has had a positive impact on him and his life and ours. And there are others that are far more emotive, and obviously it's for every individual family or person to consider. People are understandably concerned about some of the implications, but they offer huge benefits. So, for us and for Caleb, clinical trials are quite exciting. We hope that they continue, they get the support and uptake required to ultimately try and improve his quality of life, his ability to access the world as he grows older and hopefully gains more independence. So we're big advocates for our family, and I think that's my important point. It has to be right for your family and your perspectives and priorities, but for us it's definitely something we'll continue to engage with and hopefully bring some benefit to Caleb.
Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing and being so honest about your experience. I should say that you didn't come to our site, so we haven't set you up to sort of say all these wonderful things about us.
No, we'd love to. It's too far, so unfortunately, but yeah, we're really lucky with a local site. So just stuck in the Midlands for us, but yeah, it would have been nice to come up.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point though, Sarah, is that we did look at a clinical study with yourselves, but again, that just didn't fit for the boys. That they wouldn't have been able to cope with the requirements of that particular study. But then there was one on our doorstep that was. So it doesn't always work for everybody, but as Mark echoed, big advocates. But again, it has to be right for you personally. Definitely.
Absolutely. And I just want to say that we are always on the end of the phone. If anybody wants to ask any questions about clinical trials, we're very happy to take questions. Drop us an email, drop us something on social media. We're happy to answer anything, even if you think it's a silly question or you don't want to bother us, you think we're too busy. We're very happy to chat about all things clinical trials.
And I'd say we have a very good relationship with yourselves as well. So if there's anybody on the call that wants to ask us a question, to come through yourselves, and I'll happily field those or have a call with somebody or anything like that. Definitely.
Thank you so much. We don't actually have any questions in our question and answer. I think you've all done such a good job of giving such a good overview. Everyone seems happy. So thank you very much for your time, everyone. And if there is anything that you think afterwards you're not sure about, do just drop me an email and I'll put you in touch with whoever it is that your question's for, or answer it myself if I can. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.